The delivery truck pulled away from my driveway, leaving behind a single brown package on my doorstep. No return address, no delivery confirmation, just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in 20 years. The same careful script that used to leave love notes in my coffee mug every morning. The same loops and curves that signed our mortgage papers, our anniversary cards, our wedding certificate. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee growing cold in my trembling hands, staring at a ghost made of cardboard and tape. Because there was no way Thomas could have sent this package. Thomas had been dead for 2 decades. At least, that's what I'd been telling myself every night for the past 20 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of our 15th wedding anniversary started like any other Tuesday in September. Thomas kissed my forehead at 5:30 sharp, same as always, mumbling something about an early meeting at the construction site. I was 62, then still working part-time at the library, still believing that routine was the foundation of a solid marriage. He smelled like coffee and the aftershave I'd bought him for his birthday, still wearing the faded blue work shirt that made his eyes look like storm clouds. I remember rolling over and watching him through half-closed eyes as he gathered his wallet, keys, and the thermos I'd filled with black coffee the night before. He paused at the bedroom door, turned back, and said something I've replayed in my mind 10,000 times since. "Margaret, if anything ever happens to me, remember that everything I did was because I loved you, even the things that might not make sense." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Thomas had always been prone to grand statements, especially when he was stressed about work deadlines or money. The construction company he worked for had been struggling, and I assumed he was worried about layoffs. I mumbled something sleepy about him being silly and pulled the covers over my head. The last thing I heard was the front door closing with its familiar squeak, followed by the rumble of his pickup truck backing out of our driveway. He never came home. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had dinner waiting and his favorite chair pulled out from the dining table. By 7, I was calling his work phone, getting voicemail. By 8, I was pacing the kitchen, checking the window every few minutes for headlights. At 9:15, I called the police. The officer who took my statement was kind but matter-of-fact. "Middle-aged men didn't just vanish," he explained. "There was always a reason. Maybe Thomas had been drinking after work. Maybe he'd stopped to help someone with car trouble. Maybe he'd gotten distracted and lost track of time." The officer suggested I call local hospitals, just to be thorough. But his tone implied he expected Thomas to walk through the door with an apologetic bouquet and a reasonable explanation. I spent that first night sitting in the living room, still wearing the blue dress I'd chosen for our anniversary dinner, jumping at every car that passed our house. I'd prepared Thomas's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and the smell lingered in the kitchen like a promise he'd never kept. Every time headlights swept across our front window, my heart would leap, then crash when the vehicle kept driving. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Thomas's supervisor at Morrison Construction said he'd never shown up for work the previous day. His truck was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a rest stop 40 miles outside town, keys still in the ignition, wallet and work thermos sitting untouched on the passenger seat. The police found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication that Thomas had been forced to leave against his will. What they did find was more unsettling than any evidence of violence. In the glove compartment, tucked beneath registration papers and insurance documents, was an envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 sentences that would haunt me for the next 20 years. "Margaret, I have to disappear for a while. I can't explain why, but it's the only way to keep you safe. Trust that I love you more than my own life." The detective assigned to the case, a stern woman named Patricia Vance, treated the note like evidence of abandonment rather than abduction. In her mind, Thomas had simply decided to leave his life behind, crafting an elaborate disappearance to avoid the messy complications of divorce or financial responsibility. She pointed out that our joint bank account had been systematically emptied over the preceding 3 months, with cash withdrawals made at ATMs across the county during Thomas's lunch breaks. I tried to explain that Thomas would never leave willingly, that he was devoted to our marriage, that the money withdrawals must have had some other explanation. But even as I defended him, doubt began creeping into my heart like cold water through a crack in a dam. I thought about the phone calls he'd been taking in the garage lately, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. I remembered the new anxiety in his eyes during the weeks before he vanished, the way he'd started checking the locks twice before bed and glancing over his shoulder when we walked through town. Detective Vance suggested that Thomas might have been involved in something illegal, using the construction job as a cover for activities that had eventually caught up with him. She mentioned gambling debts, drug connections, money laundering schemes that sometimes involved blue-collar workers who needed quick cash. Each possibility felt like a betrayal of the man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The investigation lasted 6 months before officially going cold. During that time, I learned things about my husband that shattered my understanding of our marriage. The construction company confirmed that Thomas had been working irregular hours for the past year, sometimes leaving job sites early without explanation. A bartender at Riley's Tavern identified Thomas from a photograph, saying he'd been a regular customer on Thursday nights, always sitting alone at the back booth and making hushed phone calls. Most devastating was the discovery that Thomas had opened a second bank account without my knowledge, an account that had received irregular deposits totaling nearly $30,000 over the course of 18 months. The deposits came from a company called Meridian Holdings, a name that meant nothing to me and apparently didn't exist in any legitimate business directory. As months turned into years, I found myself living in the ruins of a marriage I'd never really understood. Friends and neighbors offered sympathy at first, then gentle suggestions that I should consider moving on, perhaps selling the house and starting fresh somewhere new. But I couldn't leave. Not when Thomas might come back. Not when every room still held traces of the life we'd built together. I kept his clothes in the closet, his coffee mug in the cabinet, his side of the bed exactly as he'd left it. I maintained the lawn the way he'd taught me, rotating between the front flower beds and the vegetable garden he'd planted behind the garage. Every year on our anniversary, I prepared the pot roast dinner he'd never made it home to eat, setting 2 places at the table out of habit and hope. The years passed with agonizing slowness. I retired from the library, started volunteering at the animal shelter, learned to fix the leaky faucets and squeaky hinges that Thomas had always handled. I made peace with loneliness, or at least learned to coexist with it. Friends urged me to declare Thomas legally dead, to collect on his life insurance policy, to open myself to the possibility of meeting someone new. But I couldn't bring myself to close that chapter when I still didn't understand how it had ended. On the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, I finally cleaned out his dresser drawers, donating his work clothes to charity and packing his personal items into boxes I stored in the attic. I kept his wedding ring, his watch, and a handful of photographs from our early years together. It felt like performing a funeral for someone who might still be alive somewhere, breathing and thinking, and possibly missing me as much as I missed him. The police file officially closed after 7 years, though Detective Vance had moved on to other cases long before that. I occasionally received calls from new investigators who wanted to review Thomas's case, usually young officers looking to make their mark by solving an old mystery. They would ask the same questions, pursue the same dead ends, and eventually reach the same conclusions. Thomas Hartley had voluntarily disappeared, probably to escape debts or legal troubles, and had successfully started a new life somewhere beyond the reach of his old obligations. By the 15th anniversary, I had stopped expecting answers. I had learned to think of Thomas as a closed book, a story that would never have a proper ending. I sold his truck, which had been gathering dust in the garage, and used the money to renovate the kitchen we'd always planned to update together. I painted the bedroom a soft yellow, replacing the blue walls he'd preferred, and rearranged the furniture to suit my solitary routines. I told myself I was healing, adapting, moving forward in the small ways that mattered. I had coffee with my neighbor Eleanor every Thursday morning, attended book club meetings at the library where I used to work, and maintained a small circle of friends who had learned not to ask about Thomas unless I brought him up first. I dated briefly, a kind man named Robert who owned the hardware store downtown, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was cheating on a ghost. The 20th anniversary arrived with unexpected weight. Perhaps it was the significance of the round number, or perhaps I was finally ready to admit that Thomas was truly gone. But I found myself unable to follow my usual ritual of preparing our anniversary dinner. Instead, I spent the day going through old photo albums, organizing the pictures chronologically, and trying to identify the exact moment when our marriage had started to unravel without my noticing. I found photographs of us at the county fair, 3 months before Thomas disappeared, both of us smiling at the camera while sharing a funnel cake. In the picture, Thomas looked relaxed and happy, his arm around my shoulders, his eyes bright with genuine joy. There was no hint of the turmoil that must have been building inside him, no shadow of the decision he was apparently already contemplating. That evening, I sat on the front porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun set behind the oak tree Thomas had planted the summer after we moved into the house. I found myself talking to him as if he could hear me, telling him about the changes in our neighborhood, the friends who had moved away, the new family with young children who had bought the Morrison place down the street. I told him I was tired of waiting, tired of preserving a shrine to a marriage that might have been built on lies I'd been too naive to recognize. I said I forgave him for leaving, even if I would never understand why, and that I was finally ready to let him go. It felt like a prayer and a goodbye, a ritual closing of a wound that had been bleeding slowly for 2 decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, I woke with a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years. I made coffee for one person, read the newspaper without glancing at the empty chair across from me, and began planning renovations for the spare bedroom I'd been using as storage space. For the first time since Thomas disappeared, I felt like I might actually have a future that didn't revolve around his absence. That afternoon, while I was sorting through boxes of old books in the garage, I heard the delivery truck rumbling up our street. I wasn't expecting any packages, but online shopping had become one of my few indulgences in recent years, and I often forgot about small orders until they arrived. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked to the front door, assuming the driver would leave whatever it was on the porch and drive away without requiring a signature. But when I opened the door, the driver was standing there holding a package roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper and secured with what looked like string rather than tape. He checked my name against the address label, asked me to sign his electronic tablet, and handed me the package with a polite nod before returning to his truck. I carried the package inside, noting its surprising weight and the absence of any return address or shipping label. Just my name and address written in black ink across the brown paper in handwriting that made my heart stop. The same careful script I'd seen on love notes, grocery lists, birthday cards, and bank statements. The same loops and curves that had signed our marriage certificate and the deed to our house. Thomas's handwriting, unmistakable and impossible. I set the package on the kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes, afraid to open it and equally afraid to leave it unopened. My hands were shaking as I carefully untied the string, which was actually rough twine that looked like it had been salvaged from some outdoor project. The brown paper fell away to reveal a wooden box, unvarnished and obviously handmade, with brass hinges and a simple latch. Inside the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a collection of items that made no sense individually, but told a story I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. A small spiral notebook filled with dates and locations written in Thomas's handwriting. A stack of photographs showing unfamiliar people in places I didn't recognize. A set of keys on a ring I'd never seen before. A driver's license with Thomas's photograph, but a different name, David Morrison, with an address in a town I'd never heard of. At the bottom of the box was an envelope marked for Margaret, in the same black ink used for the package address. Inside were 4 pages of Thomas's handwriting, closely spaced and clearly written over time. Some sections in different pens, as if he'd returned to the letter repeatedly to add new thoughts. The letter began with an apology that explained nothing, and everything at once. Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm finally dead, and the people I've been hiding from can't hurt you anymore. I know you've spent 20 years thinking I abandoned you, and I'm sorry I had to let you believe that. It was the only way to keep you safe while I finished what I'd been forced to start. The rest of the letter unfolded like a confession from a stranger who happened to share my husband's handwriting. Thomas explained that 2 years before his disappearance, he had witnessed something at a construction site that he should have ignored. A late-night meeting between his supervisor and several men who weren't connected to any legitimate construction project. Money changing hands in amounts that had nothing to do with building permits or material costs. Conversations about shipping, routes and delivery schedules that made more sense in the context of smuggling than construction. Thomas had initially convinced himself it was none of his business, but when he'd accidentally seen one of the men from that meeting on the local news, identified as a suspect in a federal drug investigation, he'd realized he was witnessing something that could destroy lives, including his own. When he'd tried to distance himself from the suspicious activities, his supervisor had made it clear that Thomas knew too much to simply walk away. The choice had been presented simply: participate in the operation or face consequences that would extend to anyone Thomas cared about. They'd showed him photographs of our house, copies of my work schedule at the library, and detailed information about my daily routines that proved they'd been watching us for weeks. The message was clear. Thomas could either help them move their product through legitimate construction shipments, or both of us would disappear permanently. For 18 months, Thomas had played along, helping to facilitate drug shipments hidden in construction supplies while secretly documenting everything he could about the operation. The mysterious bank deposits I'd discovered after his disappearance were payments for his cooperation, money he'd been forced to accept to maintain his cover. The late-night phone calls and suspicious behavior that had worried me were signs of the stress he'd been under, trying to gather enough evidence to bring down the entire network while protecting me from the consequences of his involvement. The letter explained that Thomas had finally assembled enough documentation to interest federal investigators, but turning over the evidence would have immediately identified him as the source of the information. The criminals he'd been working with had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate potential witnesses, and Thomas knew that cooperating with law enforcement would sign both of our death warrants. His disappearance had been carefully planned as the only solution he could imagine. By vanishing without explanation, he could make it appear that he'd either fled to avoid prosecution or been eliminated by his criminal associates. Either story would remove me from the equation, making it clear that I had no knowledge of his activities and posed no threat to the operation. The letter detailed the years Thomas had spent living under assumed identities, moving from town to town, always staying far enough away to keep me safe but close enough to monitor any threats that might emerge. He'd used the skills he'd learned in the Army, long before we'd met, to create new identities and survive on cash he'd saved from the forced participation in the drug operation. He'd worked construction jobs under false names, always temporary, positions that wouldn't require extensive background checks. For 20 years, he'd been gathering additional evidence against the people who'd forced him into their operation, documenting their expansion into new territories and identifying the network of legitimate businesses they used to launder money. He'd been waiting for the right moment to surface with enough proof to ensure their complete destruction, knowing that half measures would only result in retaliation against me. The notebook in the package contained location information and contact details for a federal agent named Sarah Chen, along with instructions for delivering the complete evidence file that Thomas had apparently hidden in multiple locations. The photographs showed key members of the criminal organization, some taken recently enough to prove that Thomas had been tracking them throughout his years in hiding. The fake driver's license was just one of several identities Thomas had maintained, complete with work histories and credit records that would have allowed him to live indefinitely under assumed names. The keys belonged to a storage unit containing additional evidence, financial records, and detailed documentation of the criminal network's operations spanning 2 decades. The final page of the letter was the hardest to read, not because of its content, but because of what it represented. Thomas explained that he'd been diagnosed with lung cancer 6 months earlier, a consequence of years spent working around construction materials without proper safety equipment. The disease was aggressive and had already spread beyond the possibility of treatment. He had weeks, possibly days, remaining. He'd spent his final months preparing the evidence package and arranging for its delivery to me after his death, knowing that his passing would finally make it safe for the truth to emerge. The criminals who'd forced him into hiding would have no reason to target me once Thomas was gone and no longer a threat to their operations. The statute of limitations on his forced participation had expired years earlier, and the evidence he'd compiled would be sufficient to destroy the entire network without implicating anyone else. The letter ended with words that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. Margaret, I never stopped loving you. I never wanted to leave you. Every day for 20 years, I've thought about coming home, but I couldn't risk bringing danger to your door. I hope you can forgive me for the lies I had to let you believe. I hope you understand that everything I did was to protect the only person who ever mattered to me. Please don't mourn for me any longer than you already have. I've been dead to the world for 20 years, but you've been alive in my heart every single day. Live the rest of your life for both of us. I sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, reading and rereading the letter, examining the photographs and documents, trying to reconcile the man I'd married with the man who'd written these pages. The Thomas I'd known had been honest to a fault, incapable of deception even for surprise birthday parties. Yet here was evidence of an elaborate double life spanning 2 decades, motivated not by betrayal, but by a desperate desire to protect me from consequences I'd never imagined. The grief I'd carried for 20 years began to transform into something else. Not quite relief, because Thomas was still gone and would never come home, but a kind of peace I hadn't expected to find. The man I'd loved hadn't abandoned me. He'd sacrificed everything, including our life together, to ensure my safety. The marriage I'd mourned hadn't been a lie. It had been so real, so precious to him, that he'd given up any chance of happiness to preserve my life. The next morning, I called the number Thomas had provided for Agent Chen, identifying myself simply as Margaret Hartley and saying I had information related to a federal investigation. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in the next town, a neutral location where we could talk privately without drawing attention to my house or neighborhood. Agent Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a direct manner that reminded me of Detective Vance from all those years ago. But where Vance had been dismissive of my concerns about Thomas, Chen listened carefully as I explained how I'd received the package and what it contained. She examined the documents and photographs with obvious interest, occasionally making notes in a small notebook that looked similar to the one Thomas had included in the package. When she finished reviewing everything, she leaned back in her chair and studied my face for several seconds before speaking. "Mrs. Hartley, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but your husband has been working with federal law enforcement for the past 8 years. Not directly and not officially, but the information he's been providing has been instrumental in several major investigations. We've been trying to establish direct contact with him for years, but he's been extremely careful about maintaining his cover. The room seemed to tilt around me as Agent Chen continued. The evidence in this package represents the final pieces of a puzzle we've been working on for over a decade. Your husband documented activities and connections that we never could have, discovered through traditional investigation methods. He's given us everything we need to dismantle one of the largest drug distribution networks in the region. I asked about Thomas's safety, whether there was any chance he might still be alive. Despite what his letter implied, Agent Chen's expression grew somber. We've been monitoring obituaries and death records in areas where we suspected he might be living. 3 weeks ago, a man named David Morrison died of lung cancer in a hospice facility in Colorado. The fingerprints we obtained from the facility match records we had for your husband from his military service. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. For 20 years, I'd held on to the possibility that Thomas might someday walk through our front door with an explanation that would make everything make sense. Now I knew he never would, not because he'd chosen to abandon me, but because he was truly gone. Agent Chen reached across the table and touched my hand gently. Mrs. Hartley, I want you to know that your husband is considered a hero by everyone involved in this investigation. The information he provided will result in dozens of arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in illegal assets. He spent 20 years of his life ensuring that the people who threatened you would eventually face justice. The arrests began 3 days later. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and sorrow, seeing photographs of men being led away in handcuffs, including Thomas's former supervisor from Morrison Construction. The reporters described a complex operation involving drug distribution, money laundering, and corruption that had operated for over 2 decades before being exposed by an anonymous informant. Agent Chen called to tell me that the storage unit key Thomas had provided contained additional evidence that had allowed them to recover millions of dollars in seized assets. Under federal forfeiture laws, a portion of those assets would be returned to victims of the criminal enterprise, including spouses of people who'd been coerced into participation. I told her I didn't want any money that had come from the operation that had destroyed my marriage, but she explained that Thomas had specifically requested that I receive compensation for the years I'd spent believing he'd abandoned me. He'd apparently planned every detail of his posthumous revelation, including provisions for my financial security. The house felt different after the truth emerged. Not empty anymore, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Thomas disappeared. I could finally understand the man I'd married, the choices he'd made, and the love that had motivated every sacrifice. The doubt and anger I'd carried for 20 years dissolved, replaced by pride in the husband who'd protected me at the cost of everything he'd valued. I kept the letter in the wooden box Thomas had made, reading it whenever I needed to remember that our marriage had been real and precious, and worth the price he'd paid to preserve my life. I planted a garden in the backyard where his vegetable patch had once grown, filling it with flowers instead of the practical crops he'd preferred. It seemed like a fitting memorial, beautiful but impermanent, like the love story that had shaped both our lives. 6 months later, I received a call from a lawyer in Colorado who'd been contacted by the hospice where Thomas died. Among his personal effects was a sealed envelope marked, "For Margaret, final message," along with a small metal box containing items he'd wanted me to have. The final letter was shorter than the first, written in handwriting that showed the effects of his illness, but remained unmistakably his. Margaret, if you're reading this, then you know the truth about why I left. I hope you can forgive me for the years you spent not knowing. I hope you understand that loving you was the most real thing in my life, and protecting you was the only way I could keep that love alive. The ring in this box was meant to be your 25th anniversary present. I bought it the week before I had to disappear, and I've carried it with me ever since. Please wear it and know that somewhere, somehow, I'm still loving you with everything I have. The ring was beautiful, a simple band set with small diamonds that caught light like stars. It fit perfectly on my right hand, where I wore it as a symbol not of the marriage that had been taken from us, but of the love that had endured despite 20 years of separation and silence. That evening, I sat on the front porch where I'd said goodbye to Thomas a year earlier, watching the sunset behind the oak tree he'd planted. But this time, I wasn't talking to a ghost or mourning a man who'd abandoned me. I was remembering a husband who'd loved me enough to give up everything, including the chance to say goodbye, to ensure that I would be safe. The story wasn't the one I'd expected when I married Thomas 41 years ago, but it was ours, complicated and tragic and shot through with a kind of love that most people never experience. I finally understood that some mysteries are solved, not with answers, but with acceptance. And some love stories end not with reunion, but with the recognition that true love sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. I wear Thomas's ring every day now, and when people ask about it, I tell them it was a gift from my husband. I don't explain that he's been dead for 20 years, or that he spent 2 decades in hiding to protect me, or that I only learned the truth when he arranged for his story to be delivered after his death. Instead, I simply say that he was a good man who loved me very much, and that sometimes love asks more of us than we think we can give. It's the truth, even if it's not the whole truth. And I've learned that some stories are too precious to share with strangers who wouldn't understand the weight of their telling. The package that arrived 20 years after Thomas disappeared gave me back the man I'd married and the marriage I'd mourned. It didn't bring him home, but it brought him back to my heart in a way that death and distance couldn't diminish. And that, I've come to understand, is a kind of miracle worth waiting 20 years to receive. The weeks following my meeting with Agent Chen brought a strange mixture of validation and renewed grief. Knowing the truth about Thomas's disappearance had answered the questions that had tormented me for 20 years, but it had also opened new wounds I hadn't expected. I found myself mourning not just the husband I'd lost, but the 2 decades we'd been robbed of together, the conversations we'd never had, the ordinary moments that had been stolen from us by circumstances neither of us had chosen. I started having vivid dreams about Thomas in those early weeks after receiving his package. Not the confused, desperate dreams that had plagued me in the years immediately after his disappearance, but clear, detailed visions of conversations we might have had if he'd been able to explain his situation before vanishing. In these dreams, we would sit at our kitchen table, and he would tell me about the impossible choice he'd been forced to make, asking for my understanding and forgiveness. Sometimes I would wake from these dreams feeling comforted, as if Thomas had actually visited me during the night to provide the closure we'd never been able to achieve in life. Other times, I would wake feeling cheated all over again, angry at the criminals who had forced him into hiding, and furious at the circumstances that had made his sacrifice necessary. Agent Chen called regularly during those first few weeks, updating me on the progress of the investigation, and occasionally asking questions about Thomas's behavior in the months before his disappearance. She wanted to know if I'd noticed any changes in his routine, any new anxieties or unexplained absences that might help them establish a more precise timeline for when he'd first become involved with the criminal operation. Looking back with the benefit of knowing what had really been happening, I could identify dozens of small signs I'd missed or misinterpreted at the time. The way Thomas had started insisting on doing all the grocery shopping himself, claiming he enjoyed the break from work, but probably trying to limit my exposure to potential surveillance. The new habit he'd developed of checking the locks on all our doors and windows before bed, a ritual I'd attributed to general anxiety, but now understood as genuine fear for our safety. I remembered the evening about 6 months before his disappearance, when I'd found him standing at our bedroom window at 2 a.m, staring out at the street with an intensity that had worried me. When I'd asked what was wrong, he'd claimed he thought he'd heard something outside, but his explanation had felt rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing an excuse for why he might be found keeping watch in the middle of the night. There had been phone calls, too, that made more sense in the context of Thomas's forced cooperation with criminals. Calls that would come during dinner or in the early evening, Conversations Thomas would take in the garage or basement, speaking in low tones that prevented me from overhearing even when I tried to listen. He'd always claimed they were work-related, complaints about scheduling or materials that required immediate attention. But construction emergencies rarely seemed to occur with such regularity or require such secretive discussions. Agent Chen was particularly interested in a detail I'd mentioned almost in passing during our first meeting. 3 weeks before Thomas disappeared, a man had come to our door claiming to be conducting a survey about home security systems. He'd been polite and professional, carrying an official-looking clipboard and wearing a polo shirt with a company logo I didn't recognize. He'd asked detailed questions about our daily routines, when we typically left the house, whether we had alarm systems or security cameras, information that had seemed relevant to his supposed survey, but now struck me as reconnaissance. Thomas had been unusually agitated after the man left, pacing around the house and double-checking the locks in a way that had seemed disproportionate to a simple security survey. When I'd commented on his reaction, he'd dismissed my concerns, claiming he was just being cautious, but I'd noticed him watching the street more carefully for several days afterward. Agent Chen asked me to describe the survey man in as much detail as I could remember, taking notes as I recalled his approximate age, height, hair color, and the company logo on his shirt. She seemed particularly interested when I mentioned that he'd driven a dark sedan with tinted windows, a detail that had stuck with me because it seemed unnecessarily expensive for someone conducting door-to-door surveys. During our third phone conversation, Agent Chen revealed that the man I described matched the physical description of someone they'd been tracking in connection with the criminal organization Thomas had been forced to work with. The fake security survey had likely been their way of gathering intelligence about our household routines, information they could use to demonstrate their ability to monitor and threaten me if Thomas refused to cooperate with their demands. This revelation sent a chill through me that took days to shake off. The idea that strangers had been watching our house, documenting my movements, and planning potential harm against me felt like a violation that went beyond anything I'd imagined during the years when I'd simply assumed Thomas had chosen to leave. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, just as Thomas had done in his final weeks at home, and jumping at unexpected sounds that would never have bothered me before. Agent Chen assured me that the entire criminal network was now under federal surveillance and that several key members had already been arrested, making it extremely unlikely that I faced any current danger. But she also suggested some basic security precautions I might consider, like varying my daily routines and being more aware of vehicles or individuals that seemed to appear repeatedly in my neighborhood. I took her advice seriously, altering my usual walking routes and shopping schedules, and asking my neighbor Eleanor to keep an eye on the house when I was away. Eleanor had been a steady friend throughout the 20 years since Thomas's disappearance, and she was one of the few people I felt comfortable telling about the recent revelations regarding his fate. Eleanor's reaction to the truth about Thomas was a mixture of shock, vindication, and anger that mirrored my own emotions. She'd always insisted that Thomas would never have abandoned me voluntarily, arguing with friends and neighbors who suggested he'd simply gotten tired of married life and decided to start over somewhere else. Learning that her faith in Thomas's character had been justified brought her a satisfaction that almost matched my own relief. But Eleanor was also furious about the years I'd spent doubting myself and my marriage, the countless nights I'd lain awake wondering what I'd done wrong, or failed to notice that might have driven Thomas away. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else, how the uncertainty had eaten away at my confidence and self-worth, making me question not just my relationship with Thomas, but my ability to understand the people closest to me. During one of our Thursday morning coffee sessions, about a month after I'd received Thomas's package, Eleanor asked a question that had been troubling me as well. If Thomas had been forced to disappear to protect me from criminals, why hadn't he found a way to let me know he was alive and safe? Why had he allowed me to spend 20 years believing he might be dead when he could have sent some kind of coded message or indirect communication to ease my suffering? I'd been wrestling with the same question, and Thomas's letter had provided only a partial answer. He'd written about the necessity of maintaining complete separation to avoid giving the criminals any reason to use me as leverage against him. But I wondered if there might have been ways to communicate that wouldn't have compromised my safety or his cover. Agent Chen helped me understand the complexity of Thomas's situation when I raised this question during one of our phone calls. She explained that any contact between us, no matter how carefully arranged, would have created a trail that sophisticated criminals might eventually have detected. Even indirect communication through third parties or coded messages could have provided clues about Thomas's location or activities that might have put both of us at risk. Moreover, Agent Chen pointed out that allowing me to know he was alive might actually have put me in greater danger. If I'd known Thomas was hiding rather than dead, I might have behaved differently, been less convincing in my genuine grief and confusion when questioned by police or private investigators. My authentic ignorance about Thomas's fate had been one of the most important factors in convincing the criminal organization that I posed no threat to their operations. This explanation helped me understand Thomas's choice to let me believe he was dead, but it didn't make the emotional impact of that choice any easier to accept. I struggled with feelings of anger and abandonment that seemed irrational, given what I now knew about his motivations. Part of me understood that Thomas had made the only choice available to him, but another part of me felt betrayed by his willingness to let me suffer for 20 years rather than finding some way to ease my pain. I found myself having imaginary conversations with Thomas during this period, sometimes feeling understanding and grateful for his sacrifice, other times feeling angry and hurt by his decision to protect me without my consent. I wished I could have been given the opportunity to make my own choice about the risks I was willing to accept, to have been treated as a partner in facing the threat rather than a victim who needed to be protected through deception. These conflicting emotions came to a head about 6 weeks after receiving Thomas's package, when Agent Chen called to tell me that the investigation had uncovered additional details about the extent of the surveillance and threats I'd been subjected to without my knowledge. The criminal organization had maintained files on my daily activities, work schedule, and social connections for the entire 18 months that Thomas had been forced to cooperate with them. They'd known where I shopped, what time I left for work, which friends I visited most frequently, even which doctor I saw for my annual checkups. They'd photographed me going about my daily life, documenting my routines so thoroughly that they could have approached me at any time, and demonstrated their ability to find me wherever I went. Most disturbing was the discovery that they'd made contingency plans for eliminating me if Thomas had ever tried to expose their operation or escape from their control. Agent Chen found these plans among documents seized during the arrests, detailed scenarios for making my death appear accidental or the result of random crime. Learning about the depth of the threat I'd unknowingly lived under for nearly 2 years made Thomas's decision to disappear seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. If he'd tried to involve me in his plans or sought my permission before vanishing, we both might have ended up dead. His choice to bear the emotional burden of our separation alone had literally saved my life, even though it had cost us everything we'd built together. This realization brought a new kind of peace to my grief, but it also intensified my anger at the criminals who had forced Thomas into such an impossible situation. I found myself following the news coverage of their trials obsessively, wanting to see them held accountable not just for their drug trafficking and money laundering, but for the personal devastation they'd caused by destroying my marriage and stealing 20 years of my life with Thomas. Agent Chen warned me that the legal proceedings would likely take months or even years to complete, given the complexity of the charges and the number of defendants involved. She suggested that I might want to consider providing a victim impact statement during the sentencing phase of the trials, an opportunity to tell the court how the criminal organization's actions had affected my life. The idea of speaking publicly about what Thomas and I had endured was both appealing and terrifying. Part of me wanted to ensure that the full human cost of the criminal's actions was understood by the judge and jury, but another part of me recoiled from the idea of having our private pain examined and discussed in a courtroom full of strangers. I spent several weeks considering whether to participate in the victim impact process, discussing the decision with Eleanor and with a counselor Agent Chen had recommended, who specialized in helping families affected by organized crime. The counselor, Dr. Sarah Williams, helped me understand that testifying could be both traumatic and therapeutic, forcing me to confront the full scope of what I'd lost while also giving me a voice in the process of seeking justice. During my sessions with Dr. Williams, I began to understand that my grief over Thomas's death was complicated by layers of loss I hadn't fully acknowledged. I was mourning not just the husband who had died of cancer in a Colorado hospice, but the 20 years of marriage we'd been denied, the conversations we'd never had, the shared experiences that had been stolen from us. I was also grieving the version of myself that had existed before Thomas's disappearance, the woman who had trusted in the stability of her marriage and the predictability of her future. That woman had died the night Thomas failed to come home for our anniversary dinner, and the person I'd become in the aftermath was someone I was still learning to understand and accept. Dr. Williams helped me recognize that the anger I felt toward Thomas for his decision to disappear was a normal part of the grieving process, even though intellectually, I understood that he'd had no choice. She explained that trauma and loss often create conflicting emotions that seem contradictory, but are actually natural responses to impossible situations. Through our sessions, I began to see that Thomas had been grieving too during his 20 years in hiding. He'd lost not just his wife and his home, but his identity, his career, his entire way of life. He'd been forced to give up everything that had defined him, living as a stranger to himself as well as to the world, maintaining his isolation to protect the one person he couldn't bear to lose. This perspective helped me feel compassion for Thomas's experience during his years away from home, imagining the loneliness and regret he must have carried every day. I began to understand that his decision to disappear hadn't just saved my life, it had condemned him to a kind of living death, cut off from everyone and everything he loved. 3 months after receiving Thomas's package, I made the decision to provide a victim impact statement during the sentencing phase of the trials. I wanted the court to understand that the criminals' actions had destroyed more than just Thomas's life, that their threats and manipulation had robbed us both of decades we should have spent together. Writing the statement took several weeks, as I struggled to find words that could adequately express the scope of what had been taken from us. How do you quantify 20 years of missed anniversaries, birthdays that passed without celebration, ordinary Tuesday evenings that should have been spent sharing dinner and conversation? How do you explain the weight of living with unanswered questions, the corrosive effect of doubt on memory and self-worth? I wrote about the Thomas I'd married, the man who'd planted oak trees and fixed leaky faucets and left love notes in my coffee mug. I wrote about the marriage we'd built together, based on honesty and mutual respect, and how that foundation had been shattered by forces beyond our control. I wrote about the years I'd spent questioning my own perceptions and memories, wondering if the love I'd thought we shared had been real or imagined. But I also wrote about the strength I'd discovered in myself during those 20 years alone, the resilience that had allowed me to survive uncertainty and loss without losing my capacity for hope. I wrote about the friends who'd supported me through the darkest periods, the small joys I'd found in solitary life, the ways I'd learned to honor Thomas's memory even when I didn't understand why he'd left. The statement became not just an accounting of loss, but a testament to the enduring power of love to sustain people through circumstances that seem impossible to survive. I wanted the court to understand that while the criminals had succeeded in separating Thomas and me physically, they had failed to destroy the connection that had sustained us both through 20 years of enforced separation. Agent Chen reviewed my statement before I submitted it to the court, making sure I hadn't included any details that might compromise ongoing aspects of the investigation. She told me that my words would help the judge understand the full impact of the defendant's actions, contributing to sentences that reflected not just the scope of their criminal enterprise, but the human cost of their choices. Reading my statement aloud in court was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done, but also one of the most important. Facing the men who had destroyed my marriage and stolen 20 years of my life, I was able to speak for Thomas as well as myself, giving voice to the pain and loss we'd both endured because of their greed and callousness. The defendants showed no visible reaction to my words, staring straight ahead or consulting with their lawyers rather than acknowledging my presence at the podium. But I could see the impact on the judge and jury, the way my statement brought home the personal consequences of crimes that might otherwise have seemed like abstract financial offenses. After I finished speaking, Agent Chen walked me out of the courtroom, past reporters and court personnel who had gathered to cover the high-profile case. She told me that my testimony had been powerful and important, helping to ensure that the sentences would reflect the full scope of the defendant's crimes. The lead defendant, Thomas's former supervisor who had initially forced him into cooperation, received a sentence of 25 years without possibility of parole. Others received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement in the organization. The judge specifically mentioned the impact on families like mine when explaining the severity of the sentences, acknowledging that the crimes had destroyed lives in ways that went far beyond financial harm. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Justice couldn't bring Thomas back or restore the years we'd lost, but seeing his tormentors held accountable provided a kind of peace I hadn't realized I needed. The legal system had validated what I'd always known about Thomas's character, confirming that he'd been a victim rather than a willing participant in the crimes that had torn our lives apart. The media coverage of the trial brought unexpected attention to my story, with several reporters requesting interviews about my experience as the widow of an undercover informant. I declined most of these requests, feeling that our story was too personal and complex to be reduced to newspaper headlines or television sound bites. But I did agree to speak with one journalist, a woman named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in writing about families affected by organized crime. Rebecca had covered similar cases and understood the long-term impact of criminal infiltration on innocent people's lives. She spent several hours with me, listening carefully to my story and asking thoughtful questions that helped me articulate aspects of my experience I hadn't fully processed. The article Rebecca wrote was sensitive and thorough, focusing not on the sensational aspects of Thomas's disappearance, but on the human cost of criminal enterprises that force ordinary people into impossible choices. She captured the complexity of my emotions about Thomas's decision to disappear, acknowledging both my gratitude for his sacrifice and my grief over the years we'd lost. The article brought letters from other people who had experienced similar losses, spouses and children of men and women who had been forced to disappear or had died because of their unwilling involvement with criminal organizations. Reading these letters, I realized that Thomas and I were not alone in our experience, that there were families across the country dealing with losses and separations caused by the same kind of criminal coercion. Some of the letter writers had never learned the truth about their missing family members, living with the same uncertainty and doubt I'd carried for 20 years. Others had discovered the truth through law enforcement investigations, but had been unable to speak publicly about their experiences due to ongoing security concerns. These connections with others who understood my experience helped me feel less isolated in my grief and more confident in my decision to speak publicly about what Thomas and I had endured. If sharing our story could help other families understand that they weren't alone in their losses, then the pain of reliving our experience was worthwhile. I began corresponding regularly with several of the families who had written to me, sharing resources and emotional support as we navigated the complex process of grieving losses that fell outside the normal patterns of death and divorce. We formed an informal network of people who understood the unique challenges of loving someone who had been forced to disappear, the difficulty of mourning relationships that had been interrupted rather than ended. Through these connections, I learned about support groups and counseling resources specifically designed for families affected by organized crime. I started attending monthly meetings with other people who had lost family members to criminal violence or coercion, finding comfort in the company of others who understood the complicated emotions that came with our particular type of loss. The support group helped me understand that healing from trauma like ours was not a linear process, that I might continue to experience anger, sadness, and confusion about Thomas's choices even as I grew to accept and appreciate his sacrifice. Dr. Williams had warned me that grief could resurface unexpectedly, triggered by anniversaries, news events, or seemingly unrelated experiences that reminded me of what I'd lost. She was right. Even months after learning the truth about Thomas's disappearance, I would sometimes find myself overwhelmed by sudden waves of grief that seemed to come out of nowhere. A song on the radio that reminded me of our early years together, the sight of an elderly couple holding hands in the grocery store, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning would transport me back to the life we'd shared before everything changed. But I also began to experience moments of unexpected joy and gratitude, appreciation for the love Thomas and I had shared, and amazement at the sacrifice he'd made to protect me. I started to see our story not just as a tragedy of loss and separation, but as a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances that would seem impossible to survive. These shifting perspectives on our experience helped me begin to imagine a future that honored both the grief of our separation and the gratitude I felt for having been loved so completely. I wasn't ready to consider that future in concrete terms yet, but I could feel myself beginning to believe that healing was possible, that there might be happiness waiting for me beyond the immediate work of understanding and accepting what had happened to us. The investigation that had begun with Thomas's package continued to unfold throughout that first year after his death, revealing connections and implications that extended far beyond the original criminal organization. Agent Chen kept me informed of major developments, explaining how Thomas's documentation had helped expose corruption in local government, law enforcement, and business communities that had enabled the drug trafficking operation to flourish for so many years. Several public officials were arrested on charges of accepting bribes to ignore suspicious activities or provide advance warning of law enforcement operations. Police officers who had been on the criminal organization's payroll were charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Business owners who had allowed their companies to be used for money laundering faced prosecution and asset forfeiture. Thomas's 20 years of careful documentation had provided evidence for prosecutions that would likely continue for years to come, dismantling a network of corruption that had taken decades to establish. Agent Chen told me that Thomas was being recognized internally as one of the most valuable informants in the agency's history, though his identity and contribution would remain classified to protect others who might still be working in similar situations. This recognition of Thomas's importance to the investigation brought me a pride I hadn't expected to feel. My husband had not only saved my life through his sacrifice, but had also contributed to justice on a scale that would benefit countless people who would never know his name. The man I'd married had grown into a hero during his years away from home, finding the courage to document and expose evil, even when he could never claim credit for his actions. As the first anniversary of receiving Thomas's package approached, I found myself reflecting on how completely my understanding of the past 20 years had changed. The grief and confusion that had defined my experience of widowhood had been replaced by a complex mixture of loss and pride, sadness and gratitude that felt more sustainable than the uncertainty I'd carried for so long. I was still a widow, still alone in the house Thomas and I had shared, still facing a future without the person I'd expected to grow old with. But I was no longer tormented by questions about his love or his character, no longer doubting my own perceptions or the reality of the marriage we'd built together. The truth had been more complicated and more painful than anything I'd imagined during the years when I'd assumed Thomas had simply chosen to leave. But it had also been more heroic and more loving, demonstrating depths of character and commitment that few people ever have the opportunity to display. Understanding what Thomas had sacrificed for my safety had given me a new appreciation for the ordinary life I'd been able to continue living, the simple freedoms and securities I'd taken for granted while he'd lived as a stranger to himself in order to preserve them for me. Every morning I woke up in my own bed. Every evening I sat on my own porch. Every routine pleasure of daily life had been purchased with his exile and loneliness. This recognition brought with it a responsibility I was still learning to understand. How do you live a life that someone else died to preserve? How do you honor a sacrifice so complete that the person who made it could never be publicly acknowledged or thanked? I didn't have complete answers to these questions, but I was beginning to develop a sense of how I wanted to approach them. I wanted to live fully and gratefully, appreciating the safety and freedom Thomas had died to protect. I wanted to continue sharing our story with others who might benefit from understanding that love sometimes requires sacrifices that seem impossible to survive. Most importantly, I wanted to remember Thomas not just as the man who had disappeared from my life, but as the man who had never stopped loving me, even when love required him to stay away. The package he'd arranged to have delivered after his death had given me back not just the truth about his disappearance, but the husband I'd thought I'd lost 20 years earlier. That recovery of our relationship, even in death, felt like a kind of resurrection that made all the pain of learning the truth worthwhile. Thomas was still gone, but he was no longer a mystery. He was my husband again, the man who had loved me enough to give up everything rather than risk my safety. And I was his wife again, not the abandoned woman I'd believed myself to be for 20 years, but the cherished partner whose life had been worth more to him than his own happiness. That identity, reclaimed through the words he'd written in his final months, had become the foundation for whatever future I would build in the time I had remaining. The second year after receiving Thomas's package brought unexpected complications that tested everything I thought I'd learned about healing and acceptance. Just when I'd begun to find peace with the truth about his disappearance, new questions emerged that threatened to unravel the fragile understanding I'd constructed around our story. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 13 months after the package had arrived. I was in the kitchen preparing my usual breakfast when the phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize with an area code from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another telemarketer or robocall, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, gravelly and hesitant, belonging to someone who seemed uncomfortable making the call. Mrs. Hartley? Margaret Hartley? When I confirmed my identity, there was a long pause before the man continued. My name is Robert Kellerman. I think I knew your husband, the one who went missing 20 years ago. My heart began racing immediately. The familiar anxiety response that had plagued me during the early years after Thomas's disappearance, returning with unexpected intensity. I gripped the phone tighter and asked him to explain what he meant, though part of me wanted to hang up and pretend the call had never happened. Robert Kellerman's story emerged slowly, punctuated by long silences and obvious reluctance to share details that might compromise people he cared about. He explained that he'd been following the news coverage of the criminal trials that had resulted from the federal investigation, recognizing names and faces of defendants he'd encountered during his own difficult period several decades earlier. According to Robert, he'd worked construction in the early 2000s. Around the same time, Thomas had been forced into cooperation with the criminal organization. Robert had also been approached by the same supervisor, pressured into allowing his crew to transport suspicious materials that he'd known weren't legitimate construction supplies. Unlike Thomas, Robert had been able to extricate himself from the situation relatively quickly, moving to another state and finding work with a different company before the criminal organization could establish significant leverage over him. But he'd always wondered what had happened to other workers who hadn't been as fortunate in their timing or circumstances. When he'd seen the news coverage about the trials and the mention of an informant whose documentation had been crucial, To the prosecution, Robert had begun to suspect that the missing construction worker might have been someone he'd met briefly during his own involvement with the criminal operation. He'd hesitated for months before deciding to call me, unsure whether his information would be helpful or harmful. The detail that had convinced Robert to reach out was his memory of meeting a man named Thomas, who had worked for Morrison Construction and had seemed deeply troubled by the situation they'd all been forced into. Robert remembered Thomas mentioning a wife named Margaret and expressing fear about what might happen to her if he couldn't find a way out of the criminal organization's demands. This conversation had taken place at a truck stop halfway between our town and the city where Robert had been working, during what Robert now realized had been a meeting designed to introduce new recruits to the transportation aspect of the criminal operation. Thomas had been quiet and tense throughout the meeting, and Robert had approached him afterward to see if he needed support or advice. Robert's description of that conversation sent chills through me, not because it contradicted anything I'd learned about Thomas's situation, but because it provided confirmation from an independent source that Thomas had indeed been trapped in exactly the circumstances his letter had described. More disturbing was Robert's revelation that Thomas had seemed to be planning something during their brief interaction, asking careful questions about how someone might document criminal activities without being detected. According to Robert, Thomas had been methodical in his questions, wanting to know about types of evidence that would be most valuable to law enforcement, ways to maintain records without arousing suspicion, and potential methods for protecting family members from retaliation. Robert had assumed at the time that Thomas was simply being cautious, but looking back, he realized that Thomas had already been developing the strategy that would define the next 20 years of his life. The most significant information Robert provided concerned events that had occurred after Thomas's disappearance. Robert had maintained loose contact with a few other workers who had been involved in the criminal operation, and he'd heard rumors about someone who had betrayed the organization and caused significant problems for their leadership. These rumors had circulated for years among people on the periphery of the criminal network, stories about an informant who had disappeared before he could be eliminated, but who continued to cause trouble for the organization from wherever he was hiding. Robert had never connected these stories to Thomas until he'd seen the news coverage about the federal trials, and realized that the timeline matched perfectly. But Robert also brought disturbing news about more recent developments. According to his sources, not everyone connected to the original criminal organization had been arrested in the federal sweep. There were still people at large who had been part of the operation's outer circle, individuals who had managed to avoid prosecution, but who remained bitter about the losses they'd suffered when the network was exposed. Some of these people had apparently been asking questions about the identity of the informant whose evidence had destroyed their criminal enterprise. While federal authorities had successfully kept Thomas's name out of public records and court proceedings, people within the criminal community had ways of gathering information that didn't depend on official channels. Robert was calling to warn me that my safety might still be at risk, that people who blamed Thomas for their legal troubles might decide to seek revenge against his widow once they identified him as the source of the damaging evidence. He urged me to contact Agent Chen immediately and request protection, or at least increase surveillance of my home and daily activities. The conversation with Robert left me shaken in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days after receiving Thomas's package. I'd thought the arrests and convictions had ended the threat that had originally forced Thomas into hiding, but apparently, the danger was more persistent and widespread than anyone had realized. I called Agent Chen immediately after ending the conversation with Robert, describing what he'd told me and asking whether federal authorities were aware of ongoing threats related to the case. Agent Chen's response was measured but clearly concerned, and she asked me to provide detailed information about everything Robert had shared. Within hours, Agent Chen was at my house with another federal agent I hadn't met before, a specialist in witness protection and ongoing security threats. They questioned me extensively about the phone call, recording details about Robert's claims and asking whether I'd noticed any unusual activity around my home. or changes in my daily routine that might indicate surveillance. Agent Chen explained that they had been monitoring communications within the criminal community and had detected some concerning chatter about the informant who had caused so much damage to their operations. However, they'd believed that Thomas's identity remained secure and that any threats were too vague to require immediate action. Robert's information suggested that the security around Thomas's identity might be less robust than they'd assumed, and that there were people actively working to uncover details about the informant and his family. The fact that Robert had been able to piece together Thomas's role using only public information and his own memories indicated that others with more resources and stronger motivations might also be able to identify him. The federal agents recommended several immediate security measures, including installation of a monitored alarm system in my home, regular check-ins with local law enforcement, and modifications to my daily routines that would make it harder for potential threats to predict my movements. They also suggested that I consider temporary relocation while they assessed the scope of the ongoing danger. The idea of leaving my home, the house Thomas and I had shared, and the place where I'd finally found peace with his memory, was almost unbearable. I'd spent 20 years learning to live alone in these rooms, and the thought of abandoning them now because of threats from people who couldn't accept the consequences of their own criminal choices filled me with a rage I hadn't felt since the early days after learning the truth about Thomas's disappearance. But I also understood that Thomas had given up everything to protect me from exactly this kind of danger, and that ignoring current threats would dishonor the sacrifice he'd made. If there were still people who wanted to hurt me because of the evidence he'd provided, then my safety remained as important as it had been 20 years earlier when he'd first been forced to disappear. I agreed to the security measures the federal agents recommended, though I insisted on remaining in my own home rather than accepting temporary relocation. Agent Chen arranged for round-the-clock surveillance of my property, discreet enough that I wouldn't feel like a prisoner in my own house, but comprehensive enough to detect any suspicious activity in the area. The security system installation took 2 days, during which my house was filled with technicians running wires and mounting cameras in locations that would provide complete coverage of the property without being obvious to casual observers. I found the process invasive and unsettling, a reminder that the peaceful life I'd built since learning the truth about Thomas was more fragile than I'd wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor was deeply concerned when I explained the new security measures and the reasons they'd become necessary. She'd assumed, as I had, that the arrests and convictions had ended any danger related to Thomas's involvement with the criminal organization. Learning that threats persisted 20 years after Thomas's initial disappearance made her angry in ways that surprised both of us. Eleanor had lived through the entire ordeal with me, supporting me through the uncertainty of Thomas's disappearance and celebrating with me when I'd finally learned the truth about his fate. The idea that criminals were still trying to punish our family for Thomas's courage in exposing their activities struck her as profoundly unjust, and she insisted on taking additional precautions to protect herself as well. We developed new routines for our Thursday morning coffee visits, varying the locations and times to make it harder for anyone who might be watching to predict when Eleanor would be at my house. She also agreed to carry a cell phone programmed with emergency numbers and to check in with me at predetermined times when we weren't together. These precautions felt simultaneously necessary and surreal, transforming ordinary activities into carefully planned operations that required constant awareness of potential threats. I found myself checking locks obsessively, just as Thomas had done in his final weeks at home, and jumping at unexpected sounds that would never have bothered me before. The psychological impact of living under constant security was more exhausting than I'd anticipated. Knowing that federal agents were monitoring my property and that sophisticated alarm systems were tracking every movement around my house should have made me feel safer. But instead, it served as a constant reminder that dangerous people were actively seeking opportunities to harm me. I began having trouble sleeping, lying awake, listening for sounds that might indicate someone was trying to breach the security perimeter around my home. During the day, I found myself watching for vehicles or individuals that appeared repeatedly in my neighborhood, analyzing every interaction with strangers to determine whether they might pose a threat. Dr. Williams, the counselor who had helped me process the initial revelations about Thomas's disappearance, became an invaluable resource. During this period of renewed anxiety, she helped me understand that my hypervigilance was a normal response to confirmed threats, but she also worked with me to develop coping strategies that would prevent the fear from completely dominating my daily life. Through our sessions, I began to recognize that the current situation was fundamentally different from the threats Thomas had faced 20 years earlier. He had been forced to disappear because he had no protection and no legal recourse. But I was surrounded by federal law enforcement and sophisticated security systems that hadn't been available to him. Moreover, the criminal organization that had originally threatened our family had been largely dismantled, with most of its leadership in federal prison and its operations disrupted beyond repair. The people who might still wish me harm were operating without the resources and infrastructure that had made them so dangerous in the past. These rational considerations helped reduce my anxiety to manageable levels, but they couldn't eliminate the underlying stress of knowing that people wished me harm because of choices Thomas had made to protect me and serve justice. The irony of being threatened because my husband had been heroic rather than criminal added a bitter edge to the fear I was experiencing. 3 weeks after Robert's initial phone call, Agent Chen contacted me with an update on the investigation into ongoing threats. Federal authorities had identified several individuals who were actively seeking information about the informant in the drug trafficking case, but their efforts appeared to be motivated more by curiosity and resentment than by concrete plans for revenge. The people making inquiries were mostly low-level associates of the original criminal organization, individuals who had lost jobs or income when the drug trafficking network was exposed, but who lacked the resources and connections to pose a serious threat. Their attempts to gather information about Thomas were clumsy and easily detected by federal surveillance, suggesting that they posed more of a potential nuisance than a genuine danger. However, Agent Chen also revealed that one person of greater concern had emerged during their investigation. Vincent Carlisle, who had been a financial coordinator for the criminal organization and had managed to avoid prosecution by fleeing the country before arrests began, had apparently returned to the United States using false identification. Carlisle had lost significant personal assets when federal authorities seized accounts and properties connected to the money laundering operation, and he blamed the unknown informant for the destruction of his comfortable lifestyle. Unlike the other individuals who were asking questions about Thomas, Carlisle had the financial resources and criminal connections to potentially pose a real threat. Federal authorities had been tracking Carlisle since detecting his return to the country, but he had proven skilled at avoiding surveillance and had successfully remained hidden for several weeks. Agent Chen assured me that finding Carlisle was their top priority, and that additional security measures were being implemented to ensure my protection until he could be located and arrested. The knowledge that someone with both motivation and capability was actively seeking revenge against Thomas's family brought my anxiety to levels I hadn't experienced since the immediate aftermath of his disappearance. I found myself unable to focus on routine activities, jumping at every sound and analyzing every stranger I encountered for signs of potential threat. Eleanor suggested that I consider staying with her temporarily, pointing out that Carlisle would be looking for me at my own address and might not think to search for me at a neighbor's house. But I was reluctant to put Eleanor at risk and equally unwilling to abandon the home where I'd finally found peace with Thomas's memory. Instead, I worked with Agent Chen to develop a modified routine that would keep me safe while allowing me to remain in my own house. Federal agents maintained visible presence around my property during daylight hours, while sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked all activity in the area during nighttime hours when surveillance might be less obvious to neighbors. I also agreed to carry a panic button that would immediately summon assistance if I felt threatened, and to follow predetermined escape routes if sensors detected unauthorized entry onto my property. These measures felt like preparations for war rather than normal security precautions, but they were necessary given the confirmed presence of someone who wanted to harm me. The situation escalated dramatically on a Thursday morning in early December, when motion sensors detected someone approaching my house through the wooded area behind the property at approximately 3 a.m. Federal agents responded immediately, surrounding the area and using thermal imaging equipment to track the intruder's movements. The person they found was Vincent Carlisle, armed with a handgun and carrying equipment that appeared designed for breaking into houses without triggering standard alarm systems. He had detailed plans of my property, apparently obtained through surveillance conducted over several weeks, and maps showing optimal approach routes and escape paths. Carlisle's arrest ended the immediate threat to my safety, but the discovery of how thoroughly he had been planning an attack left me shaken for weeks afterward. He had known my daily routines, the locations of security cameras, and the timing of federal surveillance shifts. Only the sophisticated motion detection system that monitored the wooded area behind my house had prevented him from reaching my back door undetected. Agent Chen explained that Carlisle had been planning to break into my house during the early morning hours, when he believed federal surveillance would be at its lightest and when I would be most vulnerable. His equipment included devices for disabling alarm systems and restraints that suggested he had planned to take me prisoner rather than simply harming me immediately. The implications of what Carlisle had been planning were too disturbing for me to fully process at first. The idea that someone had spent weeks studying my habits and developing detailed plans for attacking me in my own home violated every assumption I'd developed about my safety and security. But Carlisle's arrest also provided a kind of closure to the ongoing threat situation. Federal authorities were confident that he had been working alone, motivated by personal revenge, rather than representing any larger organization. His capture eliminated the most serious danger I'd faced since learning the truth about Thomas's disappearance. The interrogation of Carlisle revealed the full scope of the threat that had been developing against me. He had indeed identified Thomas as the source of the evidence that had destroyed the criminal organization, using a combination of public records, insider knowledge, and persistent investigation that had taken him months to complete. Carlisle had also been in contact with other former associates of the criminal organization, trying to recruit assistance for his revenge plans. However, most of these individuals had been more interested in avoiding further legal trouble than in pursuing vengeance against the informant's widow, leaving Carlisle to plan and execute his attack alone. The evidence found in Carlisle's possession included detailed surveillance reports documenting my daily activities, photographs of my house and property taken from various angles, and research into the federal security measures that had been implemented to protect me. His planning had been meticulous and patient, suggesting that he would have been difficult to stop if the motion detection system hadn't revealed his presence. Most disturbing was Carlisle's written plan for interrogating me about Thomas's activities during his years in hiding, indicating that Carlisle believed Thomas might have hidden additional evidence or assets that could be recovered. He had apparently convinced himself that forcing me to reveal Thomas's secrets would compensate him for the losses he'd suffered when the criminal organization was exposed. This revelation helped me understand that Carlisle's threat had been motivated not just by desire for revenge, but by greed and desperation that might have made him even more dangerous than someone seeking simple retribution. He had seen me not just as a symbol of his losses, but as a potential source of information that might restore his financial position. Agent Chen assured me that Carlisle's arrest had ended any organized threat against my safety, though she recommended maintaining the enhanced security measures for several more months, while federal authorities completed their investigation into his activities and contacts. The other individuals who had been asking questions about Thomas were being monitored but posed no credible threat compared to Carlisle's elaborate planning. The experience of being actively hunted by someone seeking revenge for Thomas's heroic actions forced me to confront aspects of our story that I hadn't fully considered before. Thomas's evidence hadn't just resulted in arrests and convictions. It had also disrupted the lives of people who had built their identities and financial security around criminal activities. While I felt no sympathy for people who had chosen to participate in drug trafficking and money laundering, I began to understand that the consequences of Thomas's courage extended far beyond the individuals who had been prosecuted. There were family members, associates, and business partners who had suffered losses because of the evidence he'd provided, and some of these people would always see him as a traitor rather than a hero. This realization didn't change my pride in Thomas's actions or my gratitude for the protection he'd provided, but it did help me understand why threats against me might persist even years after the original criminal organization had been destroyed. Thomas's evidence had created ripple effects that would continue to impact people's lives for decades to come. The heightened security and constant awareness of potential threats also gave me new appreciation for what Thomas had endured during his 20 years in hiding. I had experienced a few months of living with confirmed dangers and sophisticated protection, but Thomas had spent 2 decades with no security beyond his own vigilance and careful planning. Every day of his exile had required the kind of hypervigilance and strategic thinking that had exhausted me after just a few weeks. He had been forced to maintain false identities, avoid detection by both criminals and law enforcement, and document evidence against people who would have killed him without hesitation if they'd discovered his activities. The psychological toll of such sustained pressure must have been enormous, yet Thomas had persevered for 20 years, driven by love for me and commitment to justice that had never wavered despite the personal cost. My brief experience of living under threat gave me new understanding of the magnitude of his sacrifice and the strength of character it had required. As winter progressed and the immediate danger from Carlisle receded, I found myself processing not just the recent threats, but the entire arc of my relationship with Thomas and the forces that had shaped our lives together. The criminal organization that had torn us apart had reach and persistence that extended far beyond anything I'd originally understood. Thomas hadn't just been fighting a local drug trafficking operation. He'd been opposing a network of criminals whose activities had tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, government agencies, and law enforcement organizations. The scope of the corruption he'd documented explained why his evidence had been so valuable to federal authorities and why the consequences of his actions continued to reverberate years after his death. Understanding the full context of Thomas's struggle also helped me appreciate the intelligence and courage that had enabled him to survive 20 years of hiding while continuing to gather evidence against his enemies. He hadn't simply disappeared and hoped for the best. He'd systematically documented criminal activities while evading detection by people who had significant resources and powerful connections. The man who had left love notes in my coffee mug and planted oak trees in our yard had also been capable of sophisticated intelligence gathering and strategic planning that had ultimately brought down a criminal empire. These seemingly contradictory aspects of his character had been united by the same love and commitment that had defined our marriage from the beginning. As I worked through these realizations with Dr. Williams, I began to see that my experience of being threatened because of Thomas's actions was itself a testament to the importance and effectiveness of what he'd accomplished. Criminals don't seek revenge against people whose actions haven't hurt them significantly, and the persistence of threats against me was evidence that Thomas's evidence had indeed caused lasting damage to criminal operations. This perspective didn't make the fear and stress any easier to bear, but it did provide a framework for understanding why the danger had persisted and why my safety remained important to people who wanted to honor Thomas's memory. I wasn't just a widow trying to live peacefully in retirement. I was the surviving family member of someone whose actions had made the world safer for countless other people. The approach of the second anniversary of receiving Thomas's package found me in a very different emotional state than I'd occupied during the first anniversary. Instead of peaceful acceptance and gratitude for finally understanding the truth, I was grappling with ongoing consequences of that truth that extended far beyond my personal grief and healing. But I was also beginning to understand that this complexity was itself part of Thomas's legacy. He hadn't just saved my life and contributed to justice. He'd demonstrated that ordinary people could resist extraordinary evil when they found the courage to act according to their deepest values. The threats I continued to face were evidence that his actions had mattered in ways that extended far beyond our personal story. This recognition brought a new dimension to my grief and pride in Thomas's memory. I wasn't just mourning a husband who had loved me enough to disappear from my protection. I was honoring a man whose courage had contributed to justice on a scale that few people ever have the opportunity to achieve. The burden of carrying that legacy was heavier than I'd expected, but it was also a privilege that connected me to something larger than my personal loss. Thomas had trusted me to survive whatever consequences emerged from his actions, and finding ways to live up to that trust was becoming an essential part of my ongoing relationship with his memory. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it an unexpected phone call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about Thomas's story. I was tending to the flower garden he'd planted decades ago when my cell phone rang, displaying a number with a Colorado area code that I didn't recognize. Given recent events, I'd become cautious about answering unfamiliar calls, but something about the timing felt significant. The voice that greeted me was warm and professional, belonging to Dr. Patricia Mendez from Mercy General Hospital in Denver. She explained that she'd been trying to reach me for several weeks, working through administrative channels to locate the next of kin for a patient who had recently passed away in their facility. My heart stopped as she mentioned David Morrison, the name Thomas had used during his final years in hiding. Dr. Mendez explained that David had been under their care for terminal cancer treatment and had passed away peacefully 3 months earlier. She was calling because the hospital had been attempting to fulfill his final requests, which included ensuring that certain personal belongings reached his next of kin. What she said next made my knees buckle, forcing me to sit down hard on the garden bench Thomas had built years ago. According to Dr. Mendez, David Morrison had not been alone during his final weeks. He had been accompanied by a woman named Carol Davis, who had identified herself as his companion and had been with him continuously during his last days at the hospital. The revelation that Thomas had not died alone, that he'd had someone caring for him during his final illness, brought a mixture of relief and confusion that I struggled to process. Dr. Mendez explained that Carol had been devastated by David's death and had specifically requested that his personal effects be returned to his legal next of kin, rather than remaining with her. Among those personal effects was another letter addressed to me, one that Thomas had apparently written during his final days with the help of someone who had known him well enough to understand the importance of ensuring it reached me. Dr. Mendez asked if I would be willing to travel to Denver to collect these items personally, explaining that Carol Davis had specifically requested the opportunity to speak with David's family. The 3-day drive to Denver gave me time to process the implications of what Dr. Mendez had revealed. Thomas had not spent his final years completely alone, as I'd assumed from his earlier letter. Someone named Carol had been important enough to him that she'd stayed with him through his death, yet he'd never mentioned her in any of his communications to me. I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions during that long drive west. Relief that Thomas had found companionship during his exile was overshadowed by jealousy and confusion about who this woman was and what she'd meant to him. The rational part of my mind understood that Thomas had needed human connection during 20 years of isolation, but my heart struggled with the idea that another woman had shared his final moments when I hadn't even known he was dying. Agent Chen had insisted on arranging security for my trip to Denver, concerned that my travel might create opportunities for any remaining threats to target me away from the protection systems that had been installed around my home. Federal marshals met me at the Denver airport, providing discreet escort services that ensured my safety while allowing me to maintain the appearance of traveling alone. Mercy General Hospital was a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Denver, modern and efficient in the way that suggested it served a large population of patients dealing with serious illnesses. Dr. Mendez met me in the lobby, a small woman in Her 50s with kind eyes and gentle manner that immediately put me at ease despite the emotional intensity of the situation. She led me to a quiet conference room where Thomas's personal effects had been carefully organized on a table. The items were heartbreakingly few. The clothes he'd been wearing when admitted to the hospital, a worn leather wallet containing identification for David Morrison, a small notebook filled with his handwriting, and the sealed envelope bearing my name. But Dr. Mendez explained that these were only the items Thomas had specifically requested be returned to me. Carol Davis had retained other belongings that had been important to Thomas during his final years, including photographs and mementos that she felt should remain with someone who had shared his daily life, rather than being sent to family who hadn't seen him in decades. The envelope containing Thomas's final letter was thicker than the one that had been included in his original package, suggesting that he'd had more time and perhaps more peace of mind when writing these last words. Dr. Mendez gave me privacy to read the letter, explaining that Carol Davis was waiting in another part of the hospital and would meet with me whenever I felt ready for that conversation. Thomas's final letter began with an apology that was both familiar and different from his earlier communications. He wrote about his regret that I'd had to learn about Carol through hospital staff rather than from him directly, explaining that he'd struggled for years with how to tell me about the relationship that had developed during his time in hiding. According to the letter, he'd met Carol 6 years after his disappearance, when he'd been working construction under a false identity in a small town outside Denver. She'd been recently widowed, having lost her husband to a heart attack, and they'd initially bonded over their shared experience of profound loss and isolation. Thomas wrote that their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual understanding of grief rather than the passionate love that had defined our marriage. Carol had known from the beginning that Thomas was living under an assumed identity, though she hadn't learned the full details of his situation until much later in their relationship. What struck me most powerfully about Thomas's description of his relationship with Carol was his insistence that it had never replaced or diminished his love for me. He wrote about the different types of companionship that people need during different phases of their lives, explaining that Carol had provided survival and comfort during years when love would have been too dangerous and painful to sustain. The letter revealed that Carol had been instrumental in helping Thomas continue his documentation of criminal activities during his later years in hiding. She'd had administrative skills and computer expertise that had allowed them to organize and preserve evidence more effectively than Thomas could have managed alone. More importantly, Carol had provided the emotional support that had enabled Thomas to persevere through the darkest periods of his exile. There had been times, Thomas wrote, when the isolation and guilt of his situation had nearly driven him to abandon his mission and either return home regardless of the consequences or simply disappear completely from everyone's life. Carol's presence had given him reasons to continue living that were separate from his love for me, reducing the emotional pressure on our relationship while providing him with day-to-day companionship that made survival possible. Thomas wrote that he'd come to see Carol as a gift that had allowed him to honor his commitment to protecting me while maintaining his sanity and purpose during impossible circumstances. The letter also revealed details about Thomas's final years that added new dimensions to my understanding of his experience. He and Carol had lived together quietly in a small house outside Denver, maintaining the fiction that they were a retired couple who had moved to Colorado for their health and the Dow mountain air. Thomas had continued working construction sporadically, taking short-term jobs that provided income without requiring extensive background checks or long-term commitment. Carol had worked part-time at a local library, a detail that created an unexpected connection between her life and mine that Thomas had apparently found both comforting and painful. During these years, Thomas had also been receiving medical treatment for the lung disease that would eventually kill him. Carol had accompanied him to doctor appointments, helped him manage his medications, and provided the kind of daily care that chronic illness requires. She'd been his advocate with medical professionals and his support during treatments that had extended his life by several years. Thomas wrote that telling me about Carol while he was still alive would have created impossible complications for all three of us. He'd feared that knowledge of her existence would cause me additional pain without providing any benefits, since contact between us remained impossible as long as threats against my safety persisted. But he'd also recognized that Carol deserved acknowledgement for the years of love and support she'd provided, and that I deserved to know that his final years hadn't been spent in complete isolation and despair. The letter was his attempt to honor both relationships while explaining how they'd served different but equally important functions in his life. The final pages of Thomas's letter contained specific requests about how he hoped Carol and I might be able to support each other in the aftermath of his death. He'd recognized that we would both be grieving the same man while having completely different relationships with him, and he'd hoped that our shared love for him might become a foundation for mutual understanding rather than competition or resentment. Reading Thomas's final letter in the sterile quiet of a hospital conference room, I found myself crying for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate. Relief that he hadn't died alone, mixed with grief for the complexity of relationships that should have been simple. Gratitude for Carol's care mixed with jealousy of the time she'd shared with him. But underlying all these conflicting emotions was a recognition that Thomas's relationship with Carol had been another form of the sacrifice he'd made for my protection. He'd given up not just his life with me, but his right to love openly and honestly, forced to build a relationship based on partial truths and constant awareness that his past might endanger anyone who got too close to him. When I finished reading the letter, Dr. Mendez returned to check on me and ask whether I felt ready to meet with Carol. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish through that conversation or how either of us would navigate the emotional complexity of our situation. Carol Davis was waiting in a small family consultation room, and my first impression was of someone who had been carrying grief with the same weight and duration that I recognized in myself. She was perhaps 10 years younger than me, with silver hair and hands that showed the effects of hard work, wearing simple clothes that suggested practical priorities rather than vanity. Her eyes were red from recent crying, and she stood up awkwardly when I entered the room, clearly uncertain about how to greet the wife of the man she'd spent 6 years loving. We stared at each other for several seconds before she spoke, her voice quiet and careful. "Mrs. Hartley, I want you to know that David talked about you every day. He never stopped loving you or regretting the circumstances that kept you apart. I always knew that if he could have chosen freely, he would have come home to you." Her words broke something loose in my chest, and I found myself crying not from jealousy or resentment, but from gratitude that Thomas had found someone who understood the true nature of his situation. Carol hadn't been competing with me for his affections. She'd been helping him survive a situation that would have destroyed him without support. Carol explained that Thomas had told her our entire story gradually over the years they'd been together, sharing details about our marriage, my personality, and his regrets about the choices he'd been forced to make. She knew about the house we'd shared, the anniversary dinner he'd never made it home to eat, and the years I'd spent believing he'd abandoned me. She also knew about the evidence he'd been gathering and the ongoing danger that had made it impossible for him to contact me directly. Carol had helped him organize and preserve documentation during his final years, ensuring that his work would be preserved even if something happened to him before he could complete his mission. According to Carol, Thomas had spoken often about his desire to send me some kind of communication that would explain his situation without compromising my safety. They'd worked together to develop the plan for having his evidence and personal letters delivered after his death, when the truth could finally be revealed without creating additional risks. Carol had been the one to arrange for the package delivery that had brought me Thomas's first letter and evidence. She'd spent months after his death working with lawyers and private investigators to ensure that the package would reach me safely and that the evidence would be delivered to appropriate federal authorities. But she'd also preserved items that Thomas had wanted me to have, but hadn't been able to include in the original package. These included photographs from his years in hiding, showing him living the quiet life he'd built with Carol in their small house outside Denver. Looking at these pictures was profoundly disorienting, seeing Thomas aged and changed by the years we'd been apart, but also seeing him relaxed and peaceful in ways that his final letter hadn't conveyed. In the photographs, he looked like a man who had found a measure of contentment despite impossible circumstances. Someone who had learned to appreciate simple pleasures even while carrying enormous burdens. Carol showed me pictures of the garden Thomas had planted behind their house, vegetables and flowers arranged with the same care he'd brought to our yard decades earlier. She showed me the workshop he'd built in their garage, filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects that revealed his continued need to create beautiful things with his hands. Most moving were the photographs of Thomas and Carol together, images that captured the quiet affection and mutual support that had defined their relationship. They looked like a couple who had found each other late in life, grateful for companionship without the passionate intensity of young love. Carol explained that she'd known from the beginning that Thomas was carrying secrets and regrets that he couldn't share completely. She'd accepted the limitations of their relationship because she'd recognized that he was someone who had been damaged by circumstances beyond his control, and because the love he could offer had been sufficient for her own needs. She'd never expected him to forget his first wife or to love her with the same intensity he'd brought to his marriage. Instead, she'd appreciated the gentleness and gratitude he'd brought to their daily life together, the way he'd treated their relationship as a precious gift rather than something he'd deserved or earned. During his final illness, Thomas had talked extensively about his regrets and his hopes for how Carol and I might remember him after his death. He'd been particularly concerned that we might see each other as rivals rather than allies, competing for ownership of his memory rather than sharing the different aspects of his life that we'd each known. Carol had promised Thomas that she would reach out to me after his death, not to claim equal status in his affections, but to provide information that might help me understand how he'd spent his years away from home. She'd also wanted to thank me for the sacrifice I'd unknowingly made, giving up my husband so that he could protect my safety and pursue justice. Our conversation lasted most of the afternoon, covering details about Thomas's daily life, his health struggles, his continued work documenting criminal activities, and his preparations for ensuring that his evidence would reach appropriate authorities after his death. Carol answered every question I asked, providing information that helped fill the enormous gap between the husband who had disappeared and the man who had died in a Denver hospice. Carol also gave me additional items that Thomas had wanted me to have: his wedding ring, which he'd worn throughout his years in hiding, and a small wooden box he'd carved during his final months, designed specifically to hold the mementos I might want to preserve from our life together. By the time we finished talking, I felt that I had a more complete picture of Thomas's experience during our years apart. The man Carol described was recognizably the same person I'd married, changed by circumstances, but not fundamentally altered in his values or character. Most importantly, I understood that Carol had been a blessing in Thomas's life, rather than a betrayal of our marriage. She'd provided the companionship and support that had enabled him to survive his exile while maintaining his commitment to protecting me and pursuing justice. As our conversation drew to a close, Carol made a request that surprised me. She asked whether I might be willing to stay in touch with her, not as rivals for Thomas's memory, but as two women who had loved the same man and might be able to support each other through the grieving process. I agreed to Carol's suggestion, recognizing that our connection might provide healing opportunities that neither of us could achieve alone. We exchanged contact information and made tentative plans to continue our conversations once I'd had time, to process everything I'd learned. The flight home from Denver gave me hours to reflect on how dramatically my understanding of Thomas's story had changed once again. Learning about Carol's existence had added complexity to a narrative I'd thought was complete, but it had also provided reassurance that Thomas hadn't spent his final years in complete isolation and despair. Over the following weeks, Carol and I began a correspondence that gradually evolved into something approaching friendship. She sent me photographs of Thomas during his years in Denver, images that showed him aging naturally rather than being worn down by stress and fear as I'd imagined. In return, I shared memories of our early marriage, stories about the young man Thomas had been when we'd first met and fallen in love. Carol seemed genuinely interested in understanding the foundation that had sustained Thomas through 20 years of separation, the relationship that had been worth protecting at such enormous personal cost. Through my friendship with Carol, I gained new appreciation for the complexity of Thomas's emotional situation during his years in hiding. He'd been grieving our lost relationship while building a new one, maintaining hope for eventual reunion, while accepting the possibility that he might never see me again. Learning to accept and appreciate the full complexity of Thomas's experience during his years away from home became another phase of my ongoing grief and healing process. The revelations Carol had provided didn't diminish my relationship with Thomas, but they did require me to expand my understanding of his capacity for adaptation and survival under impossible circumstances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.